Matt Twyman. I'm the alumni director in class of 1988. Just wanting to welcome everyone to our second weekend edition, but our first virtual wine tasting that we're actually having. And on behalf of myself and Bessie Spears, the head of school, my colleagues, Kristen Mumford, who's the director of advancement, Heather Lowry, who is director of annual fund, Linda Ogden, and of course, Melissa Pizarro, who's our associate director of advancement. I just want to welcome you this evening. And before I turn it over to Melissa, I would like to, Bessie, if you're there, if you want to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks, Matt. And please, Matt, you're going to have to use hand signals if my connectivity.
Uh-oh. We're having a little trouble hearing Bessie.
Yeah, she might be having some connections. Why don't we do this? We could.
I think she is back. Hang on, I see her video. There we go. Bessie,
Okay.
can you hear us?
Hi, I'll try to be very quick because our connectivity, for some reason, with the rain and slush, has been a bit suspect here at Hayward House. But welcome everybody. Thanks to Matt Twyman, Melissa Pizarro, our whole advancement team, and most especially to Gerret, Copeland, and Tatiana, and Gerret's daughter Anne, who's here at the wine tasting, for their hospitality and transporting us from rainy Delaware to Bouchaine Vineyards in California. And what a great way to spend a rainy afternoon, although I imagine we have some alums and friends, Tower Hill friends from far-flung places. We'll have to do a prize for the furthest away. But we have been able to really lean into our word for the year, which is unity, and to stay connected through this challenging time. And I really want to thank our alums for all of their support and creativity, helping us to connect the Tower Hill community through a challenging year. So it is really exciting to be here. My husband, Tom, is a big Bouchaine fan and has all of the bottles and glasses ready. So we're delighted, and I'll turn it back over to Melissa. Thank you so much, Anne Rose and Gerret and Tatiana, and of course, Brian, who is, I think, going to lead us through the tasting. So thank you so much, Bouchaine Vineyards.
And thank you, Bessie, and thank you, Matt. We are truly delighted to welcome you all this evening to this exciting event intended to transport us all to the sunny Napa Valley for a special virtual tasting experience. I am joined by Brian Allard, Direct-to-Consumer Director at Bouchaine Vineyards and Winery, who will be providing some background information about the winery itself, the winemaking process, and of course, the main event, conducting our tasting this evening. Of course, none of this would be possible were it not for Mr. Gerret Copeland, a member of Tower Hill's class of 1957, and his wife, Mrs. Tatiana Copeland, owners and proprietors of Bouchaine Vineyards. While they're not able to join us live this evening, I do believe Mr. Copeland prepared a special message for the Tower Hill community, which we'll be hearing shortly. We are fortunate, however, to have with us on the Zoom Mrs. Ann Copeland Rose, former Tower Hill trustee and parent of Louisa Rose, a member of Tower Hill's class of 2019, who is unfortunately still 1 year too shy of being able to join us for this tasting. Welcome, Anne. Would you like to say a few words? I can try to find you to spotlight you. There you are.
Well, thank you, Melissa. Yes, good evening, everybody. I am coming to you live from my home office in Wilmington, and I have to admit, since we're all friends, that this is not the first time that my home office has doubled as a wine bar in the past year. So I just had to get that out there. But what perfect timing for this event. I mean, it's wet, it's dreary, it's gray, it's Sunday, but at least we can all pretend to be out in Napa Valley, at Bouchaine, on the terrace with a glass of Pinot Noir overlooking the valley as the sun sets. But in the spirit of being virtual, I would like to propose a virtual toast. And as tradition often dictates, we should stand up for toast, but I think we have all learned in this past year of Zoom that we should never stand up on Zoom calls because it can be fraught with danger and potential embarrassment. So to that extent, I will actually raise my glass instead. And I would like to propose a toast to Bessie. I hope your feed is still good that you can hear this, Bessie, but I'd like to propose it to Bessie, to all the teachers, and in fact, to all the teachers, the administrators, everybody who works at Tower Hill for the incredible job they have done over the past year. Obviously, the students have benefited from this wonderful team, but everyone gathered on this call this evening has too. All the alumni, the parents, the grandparents, the past parents, the list just goes on and on. But for everyone to take the time to keep us tied to a place that we love is just wonderful. So please join me in raising your glass or your virtual glass or whatever you have, but to Tower Hill and to everyone that makes it so special. So cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you, Anne. And it is the teachers who have been incredible. So toast to all Tower Hill teachers for sure.
Well, it's the whole team. So anyway, back to you, Melissa, and back out to Napa, I hope.
Thank you so much, Anne. It is my pleasure now to introduce your featured speaker this evening, Mr. Brian Allard. Also, please feel free to add any questions you may have as we go to the chat. Brian is encouraging us to interrupt him at any point if anyone has a question about how they should be swirling or what they should be tasting. So please don't be shy. And I will pose them to Brian as we go along. Brian, the floor is yours.
Welcome to Napa, everybody. Thank you for letting us host today. It's quite daunting to sometimes plug into the great traditions of the East Coast from way out here on the left coast. And today we'll talk about a Copeland tradition in the middle of at the very southern tip of the Napa Valley. This is our 40th year here in the Carneros region. And normally I would give this tasting and welcome you on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Copeland to Bouchaine. But today I don't have to. Mr. Copeland has prepared some kind words, and I think it's just so fitting for me to take my exit and let Mr. Copeland introduce our property.
Welcome for signing up with Bouchaine Vineyards for a lovely, lovely time of tasting wine. My wife, Tanya, is standing behind me, and I are very, very proud of Bouchaine Vineyards. And I was a student at Tower Hill for a few years and then left. But I'm so glad that Tower Hill has decided that great wine, and of course, when you add it with great music, are doing great things for the minds of children today. Bouchaine wines are very, very special. They're special for one very good reason. It's the climate, it's the environment. We're at the very bottom end of Napa Valley. We overlook San Francisco Bay, and because of that, we have cool temperatures. Foggy mornings, which are the perfect growing for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. They are my two very favorite varietals for one very good reason. Pinot Noirs are round-bodied, they're full, they're succulent, they're soft. Cabernets to me are hard, angular, and I find them acid. So that is why I have a great tendency to lean towards Pinot Noirs. I just find them a magnificently beautiful feminine wine. And we have the environment there and our vineyards to produce many styles of Pinot Noirs just because of the local climate on a mere 100 acres of vineyards. It is amazing with good farming techniques and having the right rootstock and the right wine vines on the vines. It is wonderful. And they're all different. They're all delicious. And as I've always said, the best thing is to listen to beautiful music and to drink beautiful wine.
I should tell you a little secret, you guys, and you'll be the first to know, but we're on the precipice of announcing a very special relationship with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Those of you who logged on and then those of you who linger at the end will see a drone footage of our property with the orchestra's music overplayed on top of it. There's just so much to talk about when you think about a winery like Bouchaine. We're not called Kung Fu Girl. We're not called Big Red Truck. Our wines and our labels evoke a place. So we're part of the wine business that is distinctly not commercial. Over the last 15 years in the States, small wineries have lost, those of us who remember going to a restaurant at this point, but small wineries have lost by the glass programs. They've lost store shelf space in favor of big relationships between international companies and international distributors all across the United States. And I remember when Mr. and Mrs. Copeland and I started first talking about virtual wine tasting. I'm not sure if they thought I was crazy, but they love good ideas, or at least goofy ones sometimes, and they let me go forward with it. Bouchaine was the first winery to have a virtual wine tasting program before COVID. We wanted to do this kind of thing, to be able to extend our reach and our conversation with our wine club members and be able to, replicate their Napa Valley tasting at their home with their friends. So for that reason alone, it's so nice to be able to join this friendship today. We've been closed since last March. And so for that reason, for the second reason, we're really delighted to be here. In front of me are 3 wines. They're in some ways the 3 principal stories of Bouchaine. We're going to have a rosé, a Chardonnay, and a Pinot Noir. I know a lot of you have large wine cellars, so this won't come as a surprise to any of you, but the difference between these wines. Color. Why? Well, all wine, for the most part, there's about 3 varietals that this isn't true for. All wine, just like the grapes in the store, when you squeeze the wine grapes, it bleeds see-through juice. So all of your wine in the world, whether it's a big cab or a rosé or a Chardonnay, would be the color of water. So we're going to go from wines that have a subtle different acidity, subtle different color, and we're going to start right now with rosé. Mr. Copeland alluded to this special place that we have, but we're so firmly rooted in a tradition in the Napa Valley that really started post-World War II, that even our wines come from a spirit of a place that's very different. The Copeland's property is 40 years old. We bought the place from Beringer in 1981, and our vineyard is old. And so these products here are not from somebody's leftover grape juice. It's not from somebody's new vineyard in the middle of California. Only 3% of American wines are exported in the world, and only 3% of American wines come from the Napa Valley. And you're going to dwell on the very southern tip of the Napa Valley. The top of our vineyard overlooks San Francisco and the whole San Francisco Bay. Those of you who are on the East Coast, I almost hate to tell you it's 75 here today, and it's not raining, and it probably will. We might have 10 more rainstorms. That's a live shot looking out across our terrace. And the rolling hills in another 2.5 months will be brown. And so what happens in Napa right now is we get the only shot of rain, and it's sporadic usually. Sometimes it'll rain twice a year. But the southern tip of the Napa Valley, described right here, the Bouchaine is the most southern winery. And if I drove from here to Robert Mondavi Winery, it would only take me 15 minutes. But in the summertime, the temperature would go up 20 degrees. And so what I want to tell you is you're overlooking right now the only part of the Napa Valley, really, that is set up for Pinot Noir. Wines from cooler regions are allowed to, they exhibit a little bit more acid, a little more zing, a little bit more bright notes. If you're thinking of the Philadelphia Orchestra, you'd say maybe they exhibit a little bit more violin. And right now in the Napa Valley, it's the beginning of mustard season. So that is our vineyard right there, filled with mustard. In another month, it'll all be gone away, and we'll plow it into the vineyard, and it will add nutrients to the soil. Just over that hill is the San Francisco Bay. Our vineyard, it's a 15-minute walk. If I walked from where I'm standing to the top of our vineyard, it'd take me 15 minutes only. And then I'd be on a hill, and then the whole northern part of the San Francisco Bay would be at my fingertips. And it's significant for our wines because in the southern part of Napa, we get the winds from San Francisco. Here from this precipice, we go to Robert Mondavi Winery in the summertime, it's 20 degrees hotter, it's 105 degrees. We go to Sacramento, it takes maybe an hour and a half to drive there, 25 degrees hotter, 30 degrees hotter. And over at the California coast, quite unlike the Atlantic, do not go to the California coast for your favorite picnic and think you're gonna sit there and listen to the splashing, rushing waves. It's pounding waves, it's explosive, it's freezing, and in the summertime, it features 50 degrees and so much fog, oftentimes you can't see the front of your car. In the middle of all of this juxtaposition and dramatic weather shift, not only for Bouchaine, but for vineyards, important vineyards all around the world, sits these grapevines. By day, California delivers warmth to the grapevines, and we end up going from very acidic grapes to more succulent grapes like Mr. Copeland was talking about. At night in the Napa Valley, after it's been 100 degrees, or here at Bouchaine, 85 degrees, every single night in the summer, the temperature drops to 60, 55. And that is when the grapes develop an interesting suntan. And so what you're about to experience right now, pour a little bit of the Vin Gris. Here's the first evidence of a suntan on grapes. Color. Making wine is a lot like making tea. And so our Vin Gris is made out of Pinot Noir. Chris Gajani, our winemaker, when she first got here, she started to make 2 Pinot Noirs. One for Mr. Copeland made out of Syrah, which is at least twice as dark as this. Not as acidic, a little bit more full-bodied. And this one out of Pinot, which she entitled Vin Gris as an homage to the way the winemakers in Burgundy think of their rosés. And what this is about 3 hours worth of skin contact. So the difference between this wine and the one we're going to finish with, we leave skins in contact with the juice for about 3 hours, maybe 2. Finally, for red wine across the board, about 2 weeks. And we dunk it like a tea bag. And that's how you make red wine. The one in the middle, when we finally get to it, it's golden in color. It doesn't look like a Sauvignon Blanc because it goes into oak barrel. And so as such, it gets a golden oaky color. It gets it gets imbibed with some of the flavors of oak, some of the spice of oak, etc. Sometimes some of the char of oak. So while we talk about rosé, go ahead and open up the other wines. You'll want to make sure, if you haven't yet, that at least your Pinot Noir gets a chance to air out. One of the great things that I've learned over and over, how much better all red wine tastes if you just open it an hour before you drink it. So I'm going to open up that first. And in doing so, I thought we'd talk about, how you use a wine opener. I know everyone knows how, but, one neat thing about having a wine opener like this one, or one like it, with several ledges on it, more expensive wines have longer corks. And they do so for 2 reasons. When you think of a bottle, the end of the bottle is actually less round than a cork. So you'll notice that wines that are in a lower price category, they might have a synthetic cork, a rubber cork, a composite cork. The corks are actually more round and seal the bottle poorly because the bottle itself isn't round. And so one of the great things about a cork is that it expands to meet the bottle itself. It's important because when you think of even whatever your favorite scotch is, whatever your favorite brandy, the list goes on. If you like beer, one of the big differences for wine versus those products is this cork thing. And it's one of the defining characteristics of wine. We leave it in barrel for a little while, and then the magic happens in your cellar, in the bottle itself. So we're going to try today Bouchaine's current story. 2019 Vin Gris soon will be sold out of, and then we'll move on to the next vintage. This is not now quite as zingy as it was when we first released it, and instead it's got a little bit more fruit, a little bit more succulence. These wines here, not only while you open them, but over the course of the last year have changed a lot for us. And it's just interesting to know that the vintage really does make a difference. So I'm going to let these air out and then take any questions about the wines. And if you have any questions about Napa Valley or the wine business in general, please let me know. We make wine from 100 acres. And as Mr. Copeland alluded to, if you ever own a winery, if you ever own your own, first off, you can own a winery and just buy your fruit. So one of the things a lot of people don't realize, if you're buying a $10 bottle of wine, it's probably, the label has nothing to do with a vineyard. Mr. and Mrs. Copeland have been curators, if you will, of a flavor profile on this property for 40 years. And they came here in 1981, and believe it or not, actually worked with the man who's basically recognized as the godfather of winemaking in the Napa Valley. If Robert Mondavi was the godfather of wine marketing for the whole American market, this Russian guy named Andrei Chelichev, who made all of BV's great wines for years and years, was the person who became the expert on Cabernet clones, particularly. And the Copeland stood down here with him and got his advice about what should be planted here. When you buy a parcel in the Napa Valley, it's, it might be worth $350,000, $600,000 an acre. And so it's very important that you plant your vineyard and take care of it well over the years. And I liken it to buying a home and then failing to mow the lawn or get a landscaper to help you establish the look of your property. If you have a property for 50 years and you never mow your lawn and you don't have a landscaping crew, it's going to look terrible. It almost doesn't matter how nice the house is. The same is true in the wine business. You have to have your landscaping, and it starts with what you plant. And so when Mr. and Mrs. Copeland came here, we bought 100 acres. And then we didn't just plant it all in Chardonnay or all in Pinot Noir or all in half and half. Out in our vineyard, we have about 10 different clones of Pinot Noir. Think of all the tomatoes in a store. Some are lighter in color, some have more acid, some are deeper and have more fruit. Same thing with grapes, and particularly even within the Pinot Noir grape or the Chardonnay grape. Some of the grapes are more aromatic, some are more zingy with acid, some are more tougher skinned and they'll be fuller bodied. So we'll start talking about this. It's a light bodied Pinot Noir. If I had our Pinot Noir based rosé, if I had our other rosé, it'd be twice as dark. It would have been made out of Syrah. And to extend the metaphor, when you put chamomile tea and black tea in hot water for the same amount of time, it doesn't matter what you do. Chamomile is never going to be as dark as black tea. And that's the reason why this one's a light. Pinot Noir is one of the thinnest skinned grapes in the world. And it needs to be in a cool area in order to get its suntan. If you think about it, first day of summer, you don't go out and sit by the pool for 12 hours and blast your skin off. You want your suntan to slowly develop. Same thing in the wine business. And when you own a vineyard, you want to hedge your bets. What if it's more rainy? What if it's too hot? What if it's not hot enough? And so on on Bouchaine's 100 acres, we have some grapes that do better or some clones that do better in a cold year, in a warm year, etc. And in this case, we've based we've taken a thin-skinned grape, soaked it for 2 hours. And Pinot Noir is so thin, for example, when you compare it to Cabernet. You chew on Pinot Noir, you would never buy Pinot Noir out of a store to enjoy at home. It's a small grape. It has seeds. It's lovely, but it's not nearly as succulent as those big grapes. But because the grape is small, the ratio of skin to juice is more 1-to-1. And that's what you work with as a winemaker. You're taking the juice and you're using the grape skin like a tea bag. In the case of Cabernet, Merlot, Syrah, the grapes are equally as small in the high-end areas of the world, but the grape skins themselves are different. They're thicker. If you chew on Pinot Noir, you can chew right through it, it's fine. If you chew on Cabernet, it is like the worst piece of meat you've ever had, and you just keep chewing it. But when you use it as a tea bag, it brings density. So here at Bouchaine, we're down in the Ballerina section of Napa, the Carneros region. You'll see that our labels say Carneros on them. By law, it means 85% of the fruit has to be coming from the Carneros region of Napa. It's helpful to know because when you go to stores, you got 600 bottles to choose from. What do you do? And one of the ways you can spend $3 less or $5 more and get twice as good a bottle of wine is to look for these indicators on the bottles. Bouchaine's bottles say estate. It means it comes from a plot of land that we garden, that we landscape. And so anyway, that's something it's a very prideful moment for us. We only make about 15,000 cases of wine. Most of what you touch on a store shelf is maybe 200,000 cases of wine, every one of those bottles. So when you're a winemaker, imagine the tea metaphor again, you're soaking your tea bag. You have 3 empty cups in front of you. And a wine like this one happens to be not only from Bouchaine, not only from the Napa Valley, not only from Carneros, but Estate. And that doesn't mean we have, some huge mansion here. In this case, it means 95% of the fruit must come from our own vineyard that we take care of. And so we have a wonderful story in terms of the Copeland's history of being gardeners in the Napa Valley, and another wonderful story from our female winemaker, Chris Kajani, who actually literally walks our vineyard. Her office is next to our vineyard. And so we can bring in different small parts of our vineyard and bottle it separately. Each one of these wines represents a very small bottling in and of itself, but we make about 7 Chardonnays. We make about 7 different Pinot Noirs. So this particular Pinot Noir Rosé is from our Swan clone block, and it makes kind of a zingier style, even of Pinot, but it's just one expression of Pinot Noir, like the many different styles of tomatoes. Do we have any questions that before I move on and start talking about different things? Does anyone want to know anything about wine that I should lead with?
So I actually do have 2 questions that have come through on the chat. So someone who has a 2018 bottle versus the 2019 bottle of the Vin Gris. Are there any substantial differences between the tasting notes that we have for 2019 and what we're experiencing with the 2018?
Yeah, for sure there are. And it's one of the great magics of, we're running out of our rosé. This year has been the most horrible, beautiful year and probably in the history of Bouchaine. We were month over month over month over month, 100% above, 100% above. And then last March, COVID happens and we close. And this goofy idea that we had that might have been 5% of our business or 10 becomes 100% of our business. And we end up in the Washington Post and the New York Times, or one of the very first leaders in doing this. And so we've sold out of everything. And what's neat to know, and I think this is really great to know as a microcosm in general, because you don't get a chance to do it unless you visit a winery or you have a good wine cellar. What you have, we make these rosés. They're made by the same woman. They're from the same part of our vineyard. They're made the same exact way. But as with a red wine, so too with a rosé or a Chardonnay, one part of the concoction, if you will, one part of the alchemy will be accentuated over another in the lifetime of its gestation. When a wine first comes out in the bottle, it's kind of tightly wound. In the case of Cabernet, it sticks to your teeth. It's almost like a force field. You never can really totally get to the layers of fruit and flavor behind it because you're just being attacked by a young cab. It's one of the reasons why Pinot Noir is so special, because you don't have to wait 25 years or 15 for that effect to blend into your master blend and then become more alluring. In the case of rosé, we make many different styles, but in the case, I should say we make 2 styles. And in the case of this one, it's a little bit more energized with higher acid profile. We pick it early so that there's just a little bit more acid in the fruit, and it helps sustain the wine. And so what'll happen is slowly when we pour it here, it'll go from something a little bit more zingy, dry out your mouth a little bit, to something a little bit more fruity, less drying, and a little bit more succulent. And so you're experiencing the exact same thing I am, except 1 year more wise, so to speak.
Okay, that's very helpful. We have another question. Why is the shape of the bottle different for the Vin Gris?
It's cool to know. So if I had our Riesling out here, it would be the same shape. We'd have the option maybe for, I don't know if we'd put a Pinot Blanc, or something in. But the main thing to know, I don't have, I'll see if we have a Cabernet bottle here. The principal reason, apart from marketing, behind the wine bottles, there is actually one thing that those of you who have a wine cellar can relate to that drives the, I don't want to say the science of the choice, but here's our Cabernet bottle. And you can see with this one, it's sort of like a slippery slide, or imagine it as a ski resort. This one, ski resort, you could slide down there easily. It's fine, But with this one, you'd be going over some moguls. And the reason is that when you make wine, white wine, you don't have to worry about the grape skins very much. You barely use them. You might have skin contact for a couple of hours or 0 hours. But once you start making red wine, now you are adding your tea bag. And part of what happens is, of course, the color changes with your tea. Part of what happens is the aromatic gets bigger. Part of what happens is the flavor gets more pronounced until, just as with your tea at home, it gets too bitter. So there's a time that you take your tea bag out of your tea at home. There's a time, roughly about 2 weeks, when you take your skins off the juice and throw them away. And now this is your red wine that you're going to work with. And it's going to continue to go through some processes and soften. You're going to put it into oak barrel. It'll soften it even more. But because of the skin contact, things become suspended in the red wine. When a wine is young, you don't notice it. It just seems really dark. But we all know from drinking older wine, as a red wine ages, it loses some of its color. And oftentimes, there will be things that were once upon a time suspended in the wine that fall out of the wine. It falls out of solution. And in your wine bottle, it falls into the side or into the bottom. But if you've got a proper wine cellar, you're storing it on the side so the cork doesn't dry out. And now you have sludge on the bottom of a bottle. We've all had those old bottles from a cellar where not only is there sludge in the bottom of the bottle, but it's stuck there because the wine has never been turned at all, which tells you that the cork is probably dried out in one part as well, by the way. Oftentimes that'll be the case. So number one, this is a way of marketing your wine. Number two, though, it has to do with the history of the bottles, of the varietals. Riesling, with rosé, you could put it into anything, really. Chris happened to choose a Riesling bottle. But in Switzerland, Germany, Austria, this is what Riesling would be presented in. This is sort of their history, the visual history of that region for hundreds of years. In the case of Burgundy, you're always going to see bottles like this. And, it's just sort of evoking the last 400 years or, whatever. And there are different styles of basically this bottle. Some are heavier, some are lighter, but they don't have a shoulder. This one has a shoulder because big, huge football player, sumo wrestler, Cabernet, the thick-skinned Cab, the thick-skinned Syrah, Petit Verdot, Cabernet Franc, you soak them, and you soak them. You're getting denser and denser and denser color. And then the special alchemy of the bottle and the cork begins to happen once you've bought the bottle. It's at your house. And like a soup, all of the different parts of the wine, the molecules from the skins, the molecules from the juice, the molecules from the barrel begin to literally create longer molecular strands, and until they don't. And then things start falling out. So when you open up a 50-year-old bottle or a 25-year-old bottle, this is there so you can gently pour and catch the debris as you pour. And so that's the reason for this is partly marketing, but of course it actually has a reason in the history of great wine. Truth is, for wine under $25 that's meant to be drank right away, it doesn't matter. It could be in a tin can, and oftentimes is, or plastic or something. But for the great wines, it does begin to matter. And as does the length of the cork, by the way. The longer the cork, the better the chance you have over a 50-year time that the cork's not going to be dried out, that it's going to continue to seal the bottle. Wine wants to become vinegar as soon as you make it. And the special air interplay through the cork is what makes wine, what keeps wine from going into vinegar fast, and allows you at home to begin to experience all the subtle nuances of a great wine and from a great vineyard, from an estate like Bouchaine's, where we really do, we don't even harvest here by tractor, we harvest by hand. So, for the moments you want to just go play golf and drink wine, who cares? It doesn't matter what you're drinking. For the moments you want something special, this is when the estate stories of the great houses of the world, their stability as gardeners and their stability with particular winemakers who understand their garden really comes to the fore in your bottle. And along those lines, by the way, footnote, my entire life on the East Coast, I drank my wine 30 degrees too warm. So I'm just here to tell you, when COVID goes away and we all have a dinner party again, and you guys on the East Coast are inviting friends to your terrace in the summertime, Don't do what I always did, which is, you take your wine, you pour it into everyone's glass, and you bring the bottle outside, and you continue to pour through your dinner party. For your red wines particularly, you'll be drinking them 30 degrees too warm. So you want all of these wines, one way or another, to have just a subtle chill. For the rosé, it can be a little bit more zingy, so you can have it colder. But for those of you who have the 2018 or the 2019, this is fun to know. If you want it more zingy, put it in your refrigerator, drink it colder. You want a little bit more delicate body, drink it slightly warmer. And that's true for your Chardonnay and your Pinot Noir or a Cabernet too. If you have your Chardonnay at a warmer temperature, you're going to get a little bit more of the baking spice that comes from the barrel. If you have it colder, you're going to get more of the zing that comes from the grapes themselves. Same thing with the Pinot. One of the fun things I learned when I first came out here is to have a cold red wine in the summertime just to be refreshed. But you normally wouldn't want to, because if you have it too cold, you'll miss all the nuance that comes from the grape skins.
So actually, here's a follow-up question too, related to temperature, is how would you recommend storing leftover red, if we have leftover red, that is?
Exactly. I'm going to drink all three of these bottles during this tasting. So if I start slurring my words, if I were going to store any of them afterward, what you do is two things. The simple way is just to put the cork in all of these bottles, even the red, put it in your refrigerator, let it stay there overnight, let it stay there the next day if you need to. You're not going to get more than 3 days running room out of any wine in the world, really. And the cheap ones that you want to put in your golf cart, you're going to go play tennis or something, those you won't even get 1 day. They'll lose all of their excitement. I don't know what the perfect metaphor would be, but once you open a bottle, it starts to oxidize, and you lose some of the top parts of the symphony, to go back with the Philadelphia Orchestra. So number one, at the end of this tasting, put the cork back in all these wines, put them in your refrigerator, let the refrigerator bring the temperature down and slow down the oxidation. Even better than that, if you feel like it, if you have a jelly jar, some smaller bottle that's clean, you can take the wine, put it into a smaller bottle so that there's like for example, if I put this in my refrigerator right now, it's going to have all this oxygen here. Well, the wine bottle is designed to have, this much oxygen. So if you put it into a smaller container and then into your refrigerator, it'll benefit both from the temperature and the lack of oxygen. And you can do it with all of these. Then, of course, with particularly, believe it or not, even with the Chardonnay, and especially with the Pinot, you want to take it out and let it come to almost room temperature. And then be careful in 2 more months when you guys finally want to go outside and it's not raining and it's not freezing. The wine will still taste refreshing at 75 degrees. But if you're on your terrace and you're reading a book and you're having a slow bottle, half bottle of wine or whatever, some demure third bottle of the wine, you're going to be drinking your wine 15 or 20 degrees too warm really fast. And as a consequence, you'll lose some of the flavor profile and it'll start to taste more and more boring. Particularly if you're having Cabernet, it'll start tasting like you're drinking cream all day long. You lose the multifarious quality of the wine. So temperature, both to preserve the wine as well as to present the wine to yourself or your dinner guests, so important.
So that's a great, so I do want to roll it back just a second on the topic of kind of containment. Is there any specific brand of wine glass that you recommend? What do you use to serve your wines at the vineyard?
When I first came to Napa, I'm drinking this out of a wine glass we particularly chose with our winemaker. It's important that your winemaker likes what he or she, how their wine looks in a glass, and it's got I don't know if you can see it, but kind of a larger opening, and the glass is large enough so that I can swirl it either in the air or on this table and not spill all over my jacket. But essentially, this glass is interesting because it's big enough for 2 reasons. Number one, you can get your nose close to the glass and you can swirl it. It's a lead crystal glass. And microscopically what's happening, it's different than just regular glass. The wine is scraping up against the side of the glass. And as it's doing so, it's hitting these little molecular pockets in the lead crystal and it's shooting out its aroma. And that's what you want, number one. Number two, The bigger your glass, the more you're going to be able to swirl it, the bigger the surface area will be, and the more the aroma will release, and you'll be able to smell the wine first and then taste it. And that's the key to happiness. For cheap wine, it doesn't matter if you drink them in a jelly jar. It doesn't matter if you drink it out of a flower jar, a vase. But your more expensive wines, once you get into the special parts of your wine cellar, a nice glass really does matter. 22 years ago, when I first got to Napa, I attended a Riedel tasting, and they were then promulgating, and they do still now, that every wine, because it has a different acid, it has a different density, different alcohol content, deserves to have its own special glass to accentuate the flavor profile. But the truth is, if you taste wine with winemakers, they never switch their glass. They're just interested in having a standard glass they can understand their wine from. And so for me, my answer is the bigger the glass, the better, or at least a nice one. Get a nice lead crystal glass. And then pay attention to your nose, because that's really what the glass is all about. In addition, we kind of forget about this in the modern world, but there is something awfully nice about the texture, the feel of a great glass of wine, in the look of it. You can tell a lot of things by looking at the color of a wine. This one, you can see the golden color of my Chardonnay. As a wine lover, it tells me, okay, well, it's been barrel aged, so I'm going to expect some of the spice from a barrel. Then when I swirl it, I really can easily detect the spice of a barrel. Barrels add a spice, and they'll also add to one degree or another, and they'll also add body to your wine. So those of you who love old bourbon, this is one of the big differences between wine and bourbon, or a Calvados, let's say. You drink a young Calvados, it'll rip your teeth out of your mouth. It's got so much self-evident alcohol. An old Calvados is sat in a barrel, and it's gotten softer and softer. And now it starts to taste more and more like you're just eating apples. It's beyond elegant. Same thing with wine. We get some initial flavor from the barrel, but actually one of the big differences is it ages in the bottle. And as it does so, you might, when the wine is young, start with the elements of fruit. And then when a wine gets a little older, it'll showcase some of the elements of the barrel. And then as it gets older, it'll showcase the blend of both. And when you have a good glass, that's the home run zone. For those of you who are interested in moving to the Chardonnay now, I would just notice not only the difference in smell. The first one has no barrel influence. The second one, it's going to be more luxurious. It's going to coat your teeth rather than clean your teeth. Here in Napa, we don't use Listerine. We use a really vivacious Sauvignon Blanc in the morning to clean our teeth. But you could never clean your teeth with a Chardonnay because it's meant to be more syrupy. So Bouchaine Chardonnay is particularly a more elegant Chardonnay by Napa Valley standards. We're down here in a colder area, and as such, the grapes don't become big sumo wrestlers. Chardonnay is one of the grapes that can grow in really warm areas or really cold areas. In the cold areas, it'll be brisker, brighter, more angular. In a hotter area, it will become round and filled with higher alcohol content. And so Bouchaine's Chardonnay still has a little dance because of the colder window of Carneros, the colder wind area of Carneros, but it will coat your teeth.
Yeah, this is delicious. So I had actually two people ask this question. Are all of your wines estate? I think you mentioned it has to be 95% of the estate grapes to be called estate. And if it's not an estate wine, where do you source them from other vineyards?
It depends on, when you're in a store, beware of the label that says California. It means the grapes are coming from anywhere in California. And even though the sunshine is beautiful everywhere in California, the growing conditions for grapes are not. Most of our country's wines, like any country's wines, come from high heat areas that produce thumbs down content. So if you have the middle part of California, it's 120 degrees during the day. It's particularly bad for fruit development because after 95 degrees, photosynthesis stops and the leaves literally turn away from the sun, and the photosynthetic receptors go to sleep. And then from that point forward, water starts to be sucked out of the grapes themselves. The bad part also about really warm areas is they tend to be warm at night. And so by the time the temperature drops to 90 degrees, there's no sun. And now the grapes don't do anything. The vines are doing nothing. And meanwhile, in Napa, Sonoma, Bordeaux, et cetera, a lot of the coastal regions, by the way, of the world have this interplay, the yin yang of warm days and cold nights because of the oceans. And it's at night that the vine feels like it might be a little cold, and it starts to redirect molecules into the grape skins. And in the juice, it'll insert acid. You have this countervailing acidic moment. So during the day, fruit development, less acid. At night, counterbalance. And you do this, and it's one of the reasons why a great wine has both big flavor, but also real intensity of mouthfeel and the ability to age. So anyway, is that helpful? Did I answer the question? I can't even remember.
I think so. Yeah. About so do you source grapes from any other vineyard?
Oh yeah. So this is so our story. If we were Robert Mondavi Winery, I could tell you we have one of the most amazing vineyards right next to ours. We make $175 to $200 Cabernet from it, the Tocolon Vineyard. It's right outside of our tasting room. But we also there would say we make 9 other wines, Cabernets. One's $9 and it's from California. One's $27.50 or whatever in the store. It's from Napa. And that means 75% of the fruit's from Napa. But probably in that case, because we've made a lot of it, we've bought 24.5% of the fruit from somewhere else. We've dumped it into the concoction, and now we can sell it to you for $27. Then we have one from Oakville. The middle part of the Napa Valley might be $37. And we have this big expensive one. And Bouchaine's the opposite of that story. The Copelands have spent 40 years cultivating by hand old vines and allowing them to get old enough to experience the spirit of the place in which they're growing. So if you, takes about 16, 17 years for a vineyard to sort of get into, to have roots long enough and enough development so that they start to have it's not just Chardonnay now, it's Chardonnay not just in Carneros, it's Chardonnay at Bouchaine's vineyard, right next to the bay, that because it is next to the bay, happens to get more wind, it gets more fog. It's on a swale, sort of, so it's not up against one of the Napa Valley mountains where it only might get the afternoon sun or the morning sun. So our story is about this vineyard, and the Copelands have opted to make our story central to the vineyard. And so 80% of everything that we make comes from this old vineyard that we take care of. When I first got here 3 years ago, it took us about, I don't know, we made some adjustments to the way the tasting room worked, and we got a lot more busy. We sold out of our Cabernet, and I said to our winemaker, hey, Chris, we're going to sell out of the Cab. I'm ready for the next one. And she said, well, Brian, I didn't like the vineyard we got our Cab from. I canceled the contract. We don't have any more Cabernet. We don't have Cabernet on our vineyard because it's not warm enough to make Cabernet here. So one of the ways wineries will, if they want to have a boutique story and they don't want to buy bulk juice, is that they'll go to some really great grower and say, hey, I need some Cab. And the difference between a good Cab and a bad Cab, by the way, a good one in Napa Valley might cost you about $8,000 a ton. A cheap one from Sacramento might be $800 a ton. That's about on average, to give you a sense of just your startup costs. But if you have a special vineyard, you don't want to just go and find some bulk Cabernet to counterbalance your program. You need something special. So Bouchaine has relationships with about 5 growers that we buy fruit from for 200 case productions. So the wines in front of you, we make about 2,000 cases of only. And yet for our wine club, we make about 15 different wines that we make 200 cases of only. Most of them from our own vineyard, but we have a Riesling from a different vineyard. We have a Cabernet from Howell Mountain, which is about 45 minutes from here. And it couldn't be more drastic in style. A lot of dense late summer heat, and it produces big, huge football player, succulent, dense in color, dense in mouthfeel wines. And it gives us, for our program, kind of what we need. You know, I need a $150 Cabernet to make our $80 Pinot Noir seem cheap. But I also need it so we can have this discussion. What is Pinot? What is Pinot Noir versus Cabernet? And how would you think about these wines? If you pop open a young Cabernet, you better be doing a barbecue or something smoked, some dense dish, because it's going to overpower your smoked salmon. It's going to overpower most cheeses. The list goes on. Pinot Noir is not that story. And so sometimes having the counterpoint is important in sales. And that's why, frankly, having a Merlot here, having a Cabernet here is interesting to me, even though it's not so much interesting maybe to Mr. and Mrs. Copeland or our winemaker, because they're interested in where their heart's been for 40 years, literally growing special things, special flavors in our vineyard, which, to tell you the truth, more and more, the family wineries, when they're bought by huge corporations. The corporations keep the label and sell off the vineyard. Or they don't use most of the vineyard's fruit. They just start dumping cheap fruit from somewhere else into the label. And so now the blah, blah, blah brand that you've loved for 25 years suddenly doesn't taste the same. Well, it's not just because they fired the winemaker, though they probably did. It's because the fruit is coming from somewhere totally different. And so Bouchaine is one of the great sustained stories, actually, of the Napa Valley, believe it or not.
Very good. Thank you. We actually have a couple questions also related to the Coravin system. Do you recommend that as a way to extend the wine?
So I'll mention just one thing. If you're sipping on Chardonnay, notice how it coats your teeth. Mm-hmm. Notice how it can be spicy and a little lemony, a little bit coats your tongue, lingers for a long period of time in your mouth. That's the sign of a really nice wine. This wine, believe it or not, this Chardonnay could be in your cellar for 10 years or more. Coravin is a way that you can literally, with a needle, tap into your cellar and taste the development. That's the idea behind it. I didn't know for years. I knew this guy here in the Napa Valley, would see him at dinner parties. I had no idea that he helped finance the Coravin development until later on. And I'm really glad I didn't stumble during a dinner party and tell him that I don't really like the Coravin. Within bounds, it can be really helpful. You know, obviously, if you have old Chateau Petrus, you don't just want to keep opening the bottles to see if they're good. You know, they're $3,000 bottles of wine or something, and maybe you're just interested. What does this taste like right now? So you can put the Coravin as a needle, a medical needle that goes right through the cork, and it adds argon to the bottle and takes wine out of the bottle. And it's good for a while. The problem is that as you start nibbling away at the bottle, eventually you get down to here. Now you've drank half the bottle, so half your bottle isn't wine. And no matter what, two things start to happen. It starts to oxidize. And so now this bottle, once you get halfway down, I think in the Coravin, you better start popping the cork and drinking it. The other thing that I've noticed, and I've asked some winemakers, and this is completely just a snobby reflection, but those of you who have the Coravin at home, see what you think. I think it adds ever so slightly, just a little, more of a tin quality to the flavor of the wine, a hint. I mean, you have to be a wine snob to care, but for those of you who are using Coravin on your expensive bottles, you do care already. So those are the two things to be aware of when you're thinking of using it. Apart from that, though, it's just a magnificent way of not having later today to put this wine in your refrigerator because you're afraid it's going to go bad.
And I guess this is a kind of an add-on question to that about how about an inert gas layer for keeping an additional day or two?
Yeah, and that's what the Coravin tries to do. And you know, ostensibly it should work, and probably most of the time it does. You know, it's just when you use the Coravin multiple times, you're puncturing little holes in your cork. So the cork better be in quite good shape. And then because the cork, you put this mechanism on the bottle, and the cork is, of course, in the middle of the mechanism, and it just keeps basically almost going through the same hole. So you better hope the cork's in good shape. And as you go to the well more and more, the beauty of a cork, there's an air exchange that happens between the cork and the life of your wine. And it is part of the reason why a wine cellar can be mysterious. It's the wine after it's been at your house for 7 years or 8 or 10 or 15 is no longer a product that you can go and buy in a store. It may be one of the final bottles of that vintage from that producer. It's more of a poem, and it's been sponsored in part by your home and certainly by the cork. And so, the cork allows for this slow alchemy. As you interfere with that slow alchemy, you interrupt the poem a little bit more and more. And so if you're talking just a couple of days, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to drink half the bottle and then put it in your wine cellar for 2 more years, you're probably going to return to a very different bottle, not because of the age, but also because of the corvin.
Very good. Thank you. I think we're just about caught up if we want to keep.
All right, so let's go to red wine. I know some of you started with red anyway. Here in the Napa Valley, the red grapes cost a lot of money, and so everyone talks about red grapes all the time. When I first came to Napa, I used to think Napa Valley, of course, made all the best wine in California. Why would I ever buy anything in Sonoma, et cetera? But the truth is Napa is mostly 20 degrees too warm to grow Pinot Noir. So where I'm standing here, I can look out on most of the Pinot Noir region of the Napa Valley. It's just a couple of miles. And Pinot Noir is mostly the grape of Sonoma and other coastal regions around the world. Think of Chile. You might get some Pinot Noir along the long coast of Chile, but then as you go inland, or anywhere really, as you go inland, same thing with Napa, same thing with California, the cold influences of sea air dissipate, and suddenly now you have the influences of more and more and more sun. And you migrate away from a dainty wine and into something really heavy. And that will happen for Pinot too. Pinot Noir from Bouchaine is delicate. And Chris Kajani, our winemaker, she chooses to make it even more delicate by only putting the juice in barrel for 11 months. If there are other wineries here in Napa, they have a different vineyard source, let's say, or they want a little bit more of the flavor impact of barrel rather than just fruit. They'll put their wine in oak barrel for 14 months, or in the case of a Cabernet, 24 months. Cabernet needs to soften more, Pinot Noir less. And in Chris's case, in the case of Bouchaine, we're really just delivering to you a 40-year-old vineyard in a glass. 11 months is just enough to get a little bit of flavor and color into the extra from the barrel and the wine, but not enough to overtake the flavor of the grapes themselves from our old vineyard. We have an old vineyard, we want to showcase it. And so for those of you who love Pinot, you might find our Pinot Noir sort of a mix between a California style and a European style. There's a delicacy here, and it's in part because of the weather pattern that goes over our vineyard. This wine is comprised of about the influence of about 8 different Pinot Noir clones. Some have thinner skins, some have thicker skins. Some produce more raspberry and strawberry flavor. Some produce more plum flavor. And even though our vineyard is only 100 acres, the soil changes quite a lot in the Napa Valley. A lot of people don't realize that the whole side of California used to be on the bottom of the ocean floor. And no one quite knows why, but millions of years ago, the whole thing was picked up and deposited onto the continental shelf. And as such, Napa has like 15 different soil types. And even in 100 acres, we have volcanic soil here, we have clay soil, we have slate, et cetera. And so part of what you're tasting in the Pinot is that our vines are old enough that the root systems have gone down through multiple layers of our soil. It's not a young vineyard. So you're getting a little bit of flavor just from that, and a little bit of flavor from the alchemy of making a tomato sauce out of several different kinds of tomatoes, if you will. Here at the winery, we also produce the Swan clone by itself. We isolate the Pommard clone by itself. And in Delaware, there are a few stores. You're the only state in the country that gets some of my wine club wine delivered to you. So if you're in one of those special stores in Delaware, you might see not just Bouchaine, not just Estate, not just Carneros, not just Pinot Noir, but it'll say the Swan clone, or it'll say the Pommard clone. Other things to look for on a label. We don't follow this tradition here. We use the word estate, but if Mr. and Mrs. Copeland had wanted to name our vineyard something, they could have put the Copeland Vineyard on the label. And it'd be your indication that all of the fruit, 95% or more, is just coming from one singular place. So those are some interesting things to know, not only about our wines, but about any wine in the world. If you were all winemakers today, and all we were doing is tasting through Bouchaine's Pinot Noir program, all of you would be interested. You wouldn't need me to talk, but we're one of the few places that bottles individual clones so that we isolate we can have you come here and try the Pommard clone versus the Swan clone and say, this is kind of what we work with as a winemaking team to make our flavor. So this one here, the Estate Pinot Noir, it's got the Pommard clone, the Swan clone, the Dijon clone, and several, and the stories of these clones go back through France, through the hands and the passion of monks for 500 years. And they end up in the United States, really basically post-World War II. Joseph Swan comes over with clippings from his favorite vineyard and plants them all over Sonoma. And if I were a vine, there'd be a genetic code here in the root, in the trunk, and then out by my fingertips, it would ever so slightly change. And so over a 500-year period, as one monk after another chops at the elbow or at the, whatever part, the shoulder, et cetera, and plants them, you end up with different expressions of a thin-skinned grape called Pinot Noir. It's one of the oldest grapes in the world, and it's also one of the most genetically unstable. So if you try a Pinot Noir and you say to yourself, geez, I hate Pinot, this is terrible. One of two things might be true. Number one, it might be coming from an inferior vineyard and made by somebody who it might not know what they're doing that much, and so it's terrible. Surprisingly, though, it might be actually you just don't like the clone that's prevalent in that person's vineyard. So in our case here, you're trying 7 different clones, 10 different clones, and one balances out the other in this Estate Pinot Noir. If you go to your store, the 2 stores that have combined with us today for this special occasion, you might, only because you're in Delaware, be able to buy our Pommard clone or our whatever other clone. They'll be twice as much money, and they'll be made exactly the same way from the same vineyard by the same woman, but the story will be genetically different. It'll go back to different parts of Burgundy for 400 years.
So we have actually a question about the clone. You mentioned the Swan clone. What is special about this clone?
Well, it's kind of fun. Bouchaine makes wine from the Pommard region of France, and so it's called the Pommard clone. In the late 1800s, 12 clones of Pinot Noir were developed by the University of Dijon. They're called the Dijon clone, but one is 114, one is 117, et cetera, et cetera. There are some new clones of Pinot Noir now that aren't named after a region, but rather because they've been cultivated by a university. So we just planted 4 years ago a Pinot Noir that's called 828. It's a little darker, fruity style Pinot, and it's a newer clone. When you think of the St. Clair clone, the Pommard clone, the Martini clone, these are clones that are named after people who essentially in post-World War II went to France, came back with either their suitcase or their car or their boat stuffed with clippings from old vineyards over there. And they didn't bother to tell anyone where they got them. These days you'd be put in jail probably, but then you could do it. And so the clones are named after the individuals who helped farm. They're part of the great farming story of America now. And they would propagate the clones and then sell them to their neighbors. And so the Swan clone, Joseph Swan, those of you who are familiar, there is actually, or used to be, a brand called the Joseph Swan brand with a swan on it, but the swan has nothing to do with the bottle of with his last name so much as the name of the clone, which is named after him. And the Swan clone, a little maybe like the elegance of the swan. It's elegant. It's very light bodied. So those of you who like a chewy Malbec or something wouldn't possibly perhaps like the Swan clone, but it's delicate. And so that's part of the beauty. Typically, I think at least here, you'll find our Swan clone will be lighter in color. It'll have a little bit more raspberry and strawberry in the bright parts of the note, and then you'll get into sour cherry and cherry. But with the Swan clone, at least here, and most of the places I've had it, you don't get into blackberry, plum, some of the other characteristics that frankly come from other parts of our vineyard. We have the Dijon clone, for example, bottled in two ways here. One's $85 from something we call the terraces. It's the top hill of our vineyard that overlooks San Francisco. It gets wind whipped, sun drenched. It gets a wholly different microcosm. Soon, Cisco is going to come in here and censor up our vineyard. So in a tasting like this, I can look on an app and say, oh, you know, average temperature at the terraces is X, average temperature down where the other Dijon clones are is Y, and showcase the difference in the bottles that you'll be drinking. But we have a terraces for 85, a Dijon clone for 65. They're made out of the same old vines that Mr. and Mrs. Copeland planted in 81. They're, and yet because they're 50 yards from each other, they're getting a different sun tan, so to speak. One, the terraces, has plum and blackberry, etc. The other one, the Dijon clone, same stuff, a little bit more spicy, a little bit more mushroom. And so it's fun to see the differences. So if you see the Swan name on one of our bottles, the way of thinking about it is it's going to be one of our lightest expressions of Pinot.
So another question, are clones planted or grafted?
They can be either, but I'll monetize it for you. So let's say you come out to the Napa Valley and you buy somebody's property. It's unplanted. So you might only spend $150,000 an acre or something like that. And then you're going to call a soil scientist out to find out what soil is out there. And then if you're going to do it, protect your investment, you're going to think of the expression of your vineyard above the ground and below the ground. Below the ground, you want root systems that work with the soil. And so you'll have taken soil pits all over your property to know what kinds of root systems you want where. And then you're going to order the varietal that's good for the temperature, and particularly the clone that's good for your vineyard, or that you like the expression of. And you will, in fact, graft into the root stock your clone. And more than that, you're going to pay some university or some gardener somewhere, some gardening business, to certify that neither the root system or the little stalk of clonal material you put into it have diseases. Because it's a very common thing. You buy you start your vineyard. You've just spent X. Now you're going to spend X, Y, Z on getting your vineyard planted. And then after maybe 10 years, you're going to start noticing, oh my goodness, there's a whole swath of my vineyard that doesn't get ripe enough, or something's wrong with it. It has a disease. And now, instead of amortizing your investment over a 30-year period or 25-year period, you're ripping up your vineyard at 10 or 15. Makes a big difference. And so you can just clip, if I were a vine, you could clip my arm off and put it in the ground, and a vine would grow. And it would take from that moment about 5 years before you'd get any fruit to make wine out of. But it would take about 10 years more before you realized, oh my goodness, I clipped the wrong stuff. All of this part of the vineyard is from somebody who didn't know what they were doing. They took my money, and the original vines were diseased. And so, yes, you absolutely do that, and you be very careful about it too.
Oh, thank you. So we have another, this is actually an interesting question, because I know this is a problem on the East Coast. Are you worried about the spotted lanternfly or the glassy winged sharpshooter? What sort of IPM program do you have?
I was reading, I don't know if this will affect Delaware or Philadelphia. I'm from Vermont, and I happen to notice this nasty fly that's going to come out of the ground for the first time in 30 years or something isn't going to get to Vermont. And I thought to myself, apparently it's like the size of the tulips here. So certain parts of our country have different problems. In Virginia, you'd end up with more mold problems or tendencies in your vineyard than you do out here, where we don't have any rain, and half the time we don't even have enough water. Same thing with the things that fly around and how your vineyards get infected. The first bug I've never heard of, so I'm assuming it doesn't affect the California. The second one has been a deep concern for vineyards for 10 years, at least, maybe longer, but I want to say it's 10 years. And one of the ways you'll protect yourself for it is you set traps in your vineyard and you figure out what kinds of bugs are growing there. And if you're, there are a lot of ways you can counteract the effects of it. So there are bugs in the ground that can ruin your vineyard. There are bugs that come in the, above ground, of course, and it can affect your vineyard. And the glassy winged sharpshooter will essentially bite your vine, so to speak. And from that point forward, your whole vineyard gets infected. But wineries have been really good about identifying them, seeing if they're here in Napa. They set traps out to see what's out in my vineyard. What do I need to be careful of? And you can spray for them. And so, yes, it's a thing. I'd say that in the Napa Valley, the bigger thing right now that seems to overpower everything is fires. 3 out of the last 4 years, we've had to close wineries, and some of them have burned down because of fires. And unfortunately, the Napa Valley fire season occurs exactly during the time of harvest. So you spend all of your money preparing these, these exquisite flavors. If you're lucky, the top vineyards of the world here, the top vineyards of the Napa Valley and therefore our country have been really influenced heavily in the last 3 years by fire. And for those of you who are collectors, you already know this, but the 2020 vintage, for those of you who collect Napa Valley Cabernet from great producers, not just the generic stuff, they probably won't be available at all. When you own a winery, it's almost easier not to have the vineyard because the vineyard is where the magic starts, but it's also where your expenses start too.
That's actually, you mentioned the fires. We just had a question. With the Pinot needing the moisture from the fog, have the recent fires affected the taste of recent vintages?
Yeah. So what happened, it depends when the fires happen. But the difference between, you think of it, I don't want to think of a product, mezcal versus tequila. One is affected on purpose by smoke. And you love mezcal or you don't based on whether you like that. If you like smoked meats, you have to like the taste of smoke and the spice it brings and whatever. 2020 is going to be one of the years where if you're going to sell your Cabernet, you might call it Mezcal Cab or something because it's going to be infiltrated by smoke. And what happens is, yes, smoke will follow the fog line. It'll follow the wind patterns, and it'll just, it ends up one way or another if it's lingering out there in the atmosphere. Ash, oftentimes in the Napa Valley, will fall out of the sky, and you can literally see it, and it lands on the skins. Even if you can't see it, you've got all of this smoke stuff in the air. Sometimes you can barely breathe. And then, of course, all of that ends up on the grape skins, which then, of course, ends up in the grape juice. And winemakers hate it when their wine tastes more like smoked meats rather than, something a little bit more precious. So it's not one of the flavors we choose on the high end. On the snobby end of the Napa Valley, we don't choose to cultivate smoke.
Makes sense. And how has climate change affected the microclimates of the different terraces, such as moisture, temperature?
If you guys have the map of our vineyard and you see the terraces, you'll see that they're shaped in sort of a C shape. There are parts of our vineyard that are not in a straight line. So anywhere you go in the world where you see a vineyard, typically they're in a straight line, long rows of vines. And they're designed so that each one of those rows is at the right angle to the sun, separated from the next row. So there's enough wind protection there that it influences things. You don't get too much, you have a grape zone, so to speak, so you can help avoid mold. You can get the right amount of photosynthesis, for the perfect suntan. And they're designed so that a winemaker can walk down a vine row or just walk the edge of it and taste the grape and know 350 yards straight down this line. This is basically within bounds the way this vineyard row is developing. And let's say you had 2 vine rows. If you're a winemaker, you're going to know, okay, this vine row over here gets morning sun. This side of the vine row, this side gets afternoon sun. Morning sun is cooler, so this one won't be quite as developed. This one over here will be more juicy. It might be too baked by hot afternoon sun. And so, you can bottle them separately, you can bottle them together. In the case of our terraces here at Bouchaine, one of my running jokes with Chris Kajani, our winemaker, is, who hates Cabernet, by the way. She's a Pinot Noir snob and a Pinot Noir expert. Mr. Copeland loves Pinot Noir, so it is central to our story. And on one of our hills, appropriate given Mr. Copeland's interest in wine, is on facing the bay, Chardonnay. On the other side, a little bit more shaded, Pinot Noir. You can sit on a picnic table up there and just be at the top of the world and not even hear a car. But I keep joking with Chris, Chris, that the 2 hills on our vineyard, they're the hottest part of the vineyard. With global warming, that's going to be your place for Cabernet in 10 years. And I say it facetiously because I'm not educated enough to know if that's literally true. But what if global warming affects the Napa Valley wine business? Eventually, Carneros, which is the cooler region and only able to grow Pinot Noir well and brighter fruit, can't get, for the most part, Cabernet fully ripe. So those of you who love dark cherry and cherries and these kinds of notes that Napa Valley is redolent with in its Cabernet, what's going to happen is all of that story is going to migrate south down into Carneros, where it's windier. And unfortunately, I think it's largely already happening to the top of the Napa Valley. The top of the Napa Valley has a town called Carneros. It's easy 20 degrees warmer than maybe 25 degrees warmer, and also much warmer at night than Carneros. And so it's almost out of the parameter of a great wine region right now. A couple degrees difference in wine, suddenly you'll go from tasting raspberries and strawberry to cherry, sour cherry, and then finally maybe 4 degrees, 5 degrees, whatever it is, you're tasting plum. So when you start thinking about what climate change means to the wine industry all around the world, your flavors hinge on just a couple of degrees. And Carneros is probably the spot if you want to invest in Napa Valley land, and you're aware of the influences of climate change. Buy vineyard property in Carneros, because 50 years from now, that's going to be Napa Valley's great wine region. It's going to be the only place that's going to have warm days and cold nights.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Oh, this is an interesting question too. Our bottle is a 2017 vintage, but the cork says 2019. Is that because of the aging between the picking and the bottling?
No. And I wonder why. Which is it, the Pinot Noir that you have?
Let me see. I know Molly, one of our faculty members, is asking the question. She said, yes, Pinot Noir.
So first off, this is cool to know. Vintage actually matters in the wine business, and whatever vintage. So there are some wines that have no vintage, and it just means that they've taken a conglomerate of leftover juice and put it into a bottle. And it's called Kung Fu Girl, whatever, The Prisoner, etc. It'll be a decommissioned part of a winery's brand. The year that your fruit is picked is the vintage. It's not the year you release it. And so 2017 is the vintage of this Pinot Noir. We picked it in 2017. In our case, it went into barrel for a year, and then, and this relates to the answer to your question, then it's bottled. Meanwhile, you don't grow the corks in America, they're from Portugal, and you've bought a bunch of corks. You've probably bought them emblazoned with the vintage, or sometimes it's with, whatever, on the sides of our cork it says Bouchaine. Other wineries might have their phone number so you can call them to place an order. So your juice goes from barrel, then finally, this is interesting for those of you who don't know. If you have 50 different barrels in front of you filled with the same wine from the same part of your vineyard, made by the same woman, the whole thing, you're not going to probably in a boutique, high level wine production take all 50 barrels and put them into a consolidation tank. Some of those barrels you're not going to like. and you'll isolate them and sell them off if you're a high-end producer, or maybe there's 10 of those barrels that are so exceptional, you'll make a reserve out of them. And now those barrels are twice as much money, even though everything else was the same. But eventually, one way or another, after you've tasted and tasted and tasted and tasted the barrels, you're going to put them into essentially a holding tank, a stainless steel tank, where the flavors from all the barrels will gestate just like with a soup at home. And then eventually you're going to put a hose up to the tank, and the hose leads the juice to your bottling line. At the bottling line is a holder for all of your corks. And the bottler fills the bottle and then automatically corks it and then puts your label on it, and it goes around in a circle. So probably, I'm guessing, well, there is only one explanation. Somehow somebody put the wrong vintage cork into the bottling line and it got into your bottle. The correct vintage of what you're drinking is on the front of the bottle for sure.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I think we will make this our last question, because I know we do have a very short message from Mr. Copeland to end the session, and it's actually a very good segue into that, which was, when did the Copeland family establish Bouchaine, and when did they start producing the wine?
Well, it's a great question. You know, Bouchaine it's a very interesting spot on the planet for the Napa Valley wine story. It's the first place grapes were planted in the late 1800s. Bouchaine's place on this planet is the oldest continuously operated winery in the southern part of the Napa Valley. When the Copelands bought this property, and it feels so almost shameful that I'm telling this story with a member of the family on the call, so feel free to interrupt me on. But when they bought the property, they bought it from Beringer, and Beringer had been using the property post World War II. The property was set up for bulk wine production for them. You know, they were making their really great, exquisite stuff up at Beringer, but down here they were just using, they didn't even have the vineyard planted. They were just using tanks to process bulk juice and make something that was palatable to the American marketplace. When the Copelands came here, they planted a vineyard, and they worked with, among others, Andrei Chelychev. And Andrei Chelychev, this Russian guy who ran BV for 40 years, was the first person in America to begin to experiment with different clones of Cabernet. He recognized that different clones out in his vineyard didn't produce the same quantity of fruit, didn't produce the same character of fruit, a quality of fruit. And so when the Copeland started here, believe it or not, in Russian, Mrs. Copeland speaks 7 languages. One is Russian. She's talking to the master of winemaking from the 60s and 70s about Bouchaine. And he tells her this is a great property. And so our story in some ways mirrors BV's. We're one of the great houses of the Napa Valley that planted multiple clones and bottled multiple clones separately. And it's our story. But when you buy a vineyard with a property with no vines on it, first, like I said, you're going to get a soil scientist, probably, maybe not in the early 1981 is when Mr. and Mrs. Copeland bought the property. So they may not then. Soil scientists started coming into the mix around the 200s here in the States. But nevertheless, you get an expert and you plant your vineyard according to where you think the sun is going to hit it, according to the different soil types. And then you hedge your bets. You have 100 acres. You don't want to plant it all on the same thing, because if it's a really hot year, it could wipe out your entire vineyard. You don't get any expression, nothing good. So you do kind of plant different things the same way we would around a house. You know, you don't have just all birch trees or something. And this is true for vineyards not in hillsides. So it might take you 4 years to get your first little small amount of fruit. 5 years really is your moment of happiness for your first very tiny production. Vineyards age on a bell curve. And at the beginning and the end of their life, they're just like humans. They produce less. If you own a vineyard and you're only interested in the home run zone of volume, you're going to rip it up at the top of the bell curve. If you're interested in the backside of the bell curve, if you find older people oftentimes are more interesting, let's face it, that's why you let your vineyard get a little bit older and the expression becomes more rich. And so year 5, you might get your first Pinot Noir. Year 18, year 19, 17, somewhere in there is going to be when you get your first Pinot Noir that might be singing the the Bouchaine Vineyards song. And this is true all around the world. You have to wait a little while for the vines to come in their own. They might be producing great Merlot, great Cab, great Pinot Noir, but the alchemy, the spirit of the place in which your property is takes a little while to begin its story. And so we've replanted parts of our vineyard, but in these wines today, you're tasting a 40-year history in parts of them too. And so 5 years, if we were up in the hillsides of the Napa Valley, I'd be talking about maybe 7 or 8 years. If it was a particularly rocky soil in Europe, let's say, I don't know, parts of Sicily or something where it's all volcanic soil, you might be talking 10 years before you get your first dime of back on your investment, your first bottle of wine. So, you know, Napa's nice that way too. Where Bouchaine is, the Copelands must have been, I wasn't here, of course, but enjoying their first bottle of expression 4 years out.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. So I guess in closing, I do have a comment from a participant. This is one of the most informative wine tastings we have heard, including some other very good small vineyards. Excellent. So thank you so much,
Cheers.
Brian. Cheers. Actually, we did want to try to get a screenshot. I don't know if I'll be able to do that. Spotlight. So let me see if I can go into gallery view here. So if everyone wants to hold up their glass.
Yeah, if you take me off of Spotlight, you might automatically get a screenshot. And then don't let me forget, usually I have to host these things, but today Mr. Copeland is co-hosting, and I have a fun message from him to finish us off.
Oh, that's awesome. So actually, it's hard to hold up a glass.
Rob, can you take me off of Spotlight from here? Maybe that would help.
Here we go. My husband will hold up my glass while I take the screenshot. All right, everyone hold up a glass and say cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, Brian. That was fabulous.
Wonderful. Thank you so much,
Anne. And I love hearing how the Bouchaine story intersects with the Tower Hill story. And I will tell you also that our students were very interested when I told them that our alumni and parents and the Tower Hill community outside of school were connecting in creative ways. And I happened to make the mistake of saying there was a wine tasting, and they said, Mrs. Spears, what about us? So anyway, what we are honored, it's such an honor to be able to connect with the Bouchaine story, and what an incredible story it is.
Indeed.
Of a new vocabulary in the wine business, everybody. You're suddenly going to be able to get on a Zoom call with all of your favorite winemakers and all of your favorite brands all around the world. We're going to start an international wine discussion next. This is the first time in 15 years small wineries have a national voice. And so it really, truly is our honor to think that we're here. We're still closed. We open up in 3 weeks. We're here and we're talking to 100 of you today on the East Coast where it's raining and it's 70 degrees. It is just mind-boggling, but it's the fulfillment of a dream for us. And I guess without further ado, I'll let Mr. Copeland finish this off in his style, and then I'll go outside, and you're all welcome to linger on for a second or two after his message, talk, but I'll span the Napa Valley so you can be transported here until you can come in person.
Thank you.
You've had the wonderful opportunity to drink our wines and enjoy them. And as I said, there's nothing better than listening to beautiful music and drinking wonderful fine wines. So please come to California, come to Napa, and do come to Bouchaine. We will give you a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Brian, thank you so much. And we have several comments in the chat saying we can't wait to visit, planning to go later this year. So we really appreciate your taking the time to spend tonight with us and taste these delicious wines.
Thank you, Melissa, for all your hard work in setting this wonderful event up. It was so much fun to visit this virtually, and I know a lot of us are wanting to go see it in real life.
I don't know if Brian is still with us.
I am here if you need me.
Oh, there you are.
Is my bow tie still straight?
It's perfect. Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
No, thank you all so much. It's really from the bottom of our hearts here at Bouchaine. It's a great honor, and we really appreciate it. We have quite a wonderful story here, but when you combine it to the story of Mr. Copeland's life in Delaware, it makes it so much more powerful. And we're really tickled to be able to do it, actually. So
and we're
come again.
And we're grateful to
needless
be
to
able
say,
to
come and join us.
wines in Delaware. So
That's right, please.
Cheers, everybody. Cheers to Bouchaine and the Copelands, and Brian, to you as well. And cheers to Tower Hill teachers. And thanks for starting us off that way. Have a good Sunday evening.
thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Have
everybody.
a good evening. We'll see you soon.